समाक्षरसमाम्नयमधिगम्यमहि शरत्कृत्स्नं व्याकरणं प्रोक्तं तस्मै पाणिनीय नमः। वाक्यकारं वररुचिं भाष्यकारं पतञ्जलिं प्रणतोऽस्मि मुनित्रयं नत्वा सरस्वतीं देवीं शुद्धां गुण्यां करोम्यहं पाणिनीयप्रवेशाय लघुसिद्धान्तकौमुदीम्। बाध्यबाधकभावप्रकरणे विप्रतिषेधे परं कार्यम् इत्यस्य सूत्रस्य अध्ययनम् अस्माभिः क्रियमाणमस्ति। Let's revise once again. We mentioned that यत्र यत्र द्वयोः सूत्रयोः एकस्मिन् एव स्थले प्राप्तिः अस्ति तत्र सामान्यरूपेण पूर्व पर नित्य अन्तरङ्ग अपवाद इति परिभाषेन्दुशेखरे दीयते। अस्य विरुद्धक्रमेण इत्युक्ते प्रारम्भे अपवादः, तदनन्तरम् अन्तरङ्गत्वं, तदनन्तरं नित्यानित्यत्वं, तदनन्तरं पूर्वपरत्वम्। अनेन क्रमेण तत्र निर्णयः करणीयः कस्य सूत्रस्य तत्र प्रसक्तिः भवेत् इति। इत्यस्मिन् विषये परिभाषेन्दुशेखरे बाधबीजप्रकरणम् इति अन्यत् प्रकरणमपि पाठितमस्ति। तत्र आदौ पूर्वपरनित्यान्तरङ्गापवादानाम् उत्तरोत्तरं बलिः इति परिभाषां सः पाठयति। तदनन्तरं कानिचन सूत्राणि विप्रतिषेधस्य इत्युक्ते पूर्वपरस्य विषये, तदनन्तरं कानिचन सूत्राणि नित्यानित्यस्य विषये, तदनन्तरं कानिचन सूत्राणि अन्तरङ्गबहिरङ्गस्य विषये, तदनन्तरं च सूत्राणि उत्सर्गापवादस्य विषये परिभाषाः, सूत्राणि इत्युक्ते परिभाषाः पाठिताः सर्वाः वर्तन्ते। एतत् सर्वं दृष्ट्वा विप्रतिषेधे परं कार्यम् इति सूत्रस्य अपि अस्माभिः कस्यचित् अंशस्य अध्ययनं कृतं। सो वी सेड व्हाट इज अ विप्रतिषेध? द्वौ प्रसंगौ अन्यार्थौ एकस्मिन् सः विप्रतिषेधः। अर्थ मीन्स प्रयोजन, अन्यत् प्रयोजनं ययोः विद्यते, दे शुड हैव देयर ओन execution possibility elsewhere and then they are now conflicting. द्वौ प्रसंगौ यदन्यार्थौ भवतः एकस्मिंश युगपत् प्राप्नुतः सः विप्रतिषेधः. And then he gives an example of ato dirgho yai or supicha and bahuvachane jhalyeta vrukṣābhyām vrukṣeshu and vrukṣebhyah. Then he says there are two possibilities when the two conflict each other. Either both of them will take different paths. So trujadibhihi tulyam paryayah prapnoti. Just like the way in anvul truchau, we also have anvul pratyaya, we also have a truch pratyaya. In the same way, we can have, say, supicha giving akaradesha and bahuvachane jhalyeta giving ekaradesha in different branches of the prakriya, giving two alternate forms. Or apratipattihi va ubhayoho tulyabalatvat, or just like a servant, he gives an example. द्वयोः तुल्यबलयोः एकः प्रेष्यः भवति, पर्यायेण कार्यं करोति, यदा तम् उभौ युगपत् प्रेषयता नानादिक्षु च कार्ये भवतः, तदा यदि असौ अविरोधार्थी उभयोः कार्यं न करोति, he will basically keep quiet and not do anything. तत्र प्रतिपत्त्यर्थं वचनम्. In this second case, we want to decide which sutra should execute, so we say vipratishethe param avashyam karyam. So that is a vidhi sutra interpretation. After the parasutra, we might be still able to do the purva sutra, whereas in case of trujadibhistulyam paryayah prapnoti, we say only parasutra, the purva sutra will not happen. So it is a niyama interpretation of vipratishethe param karyam. In this particular entire context, we also studied or we also looked at this particular table. यत्र प्रसक्तिः अस्ति, विकल्पः वर्तते, तत्र कय्यटेन व्यक्तिपक्ष इति तस्य नाम दत्तमस्ति. अत्र नियमनं क्रियते विप्रतिषेधे परम एव कार्यम्. In the second option, द्वारं क्रियते विप्रतिषेधे परम अवश्यं कार्यम्. And then there are two different paribhashas that come out of this. सकृद्गतो विप्रतिषेधे यद् बाधितं तद् बाधितमेव and पुनः प्रसंग विज्ञानात् सिद्धम्. Out of this, we studied sakrudgato vipratishethe yad badhitam tad badhitamev. We took multiple examples of this. We saw malayam, we saw matyam, we saw yushmad sarvanamnaha napumsakalingasya prathama ekvachan. We saw tres trayaha. That was, I think, the first sutra we saw. Tisrunam ityatra tres trayaha and tri chaturos triyam tisra chatusru. Etayoho madhye tatra vipratishedaha vidyate. So agre gacchamaha. The next set of examples that I want to give are the examples of this Punav Prasanga Vijnana Siddham, where you do the previous sutra because it is a parasutra, and then you are forced to execute the same sutra that was blocked. Why? Because you want to get a sadhu form. So everything is driven by what is a sadhu form. So we say Punah Prasanga Vijnana Siddham. Tatra yasya sutrasya badhaha kriyate tasya Punah Prasangaha asti, and therefore it gets executed. Now, unfortunately, the examples of this Punah Prasanga Vijnana Siddham are mostly in the Tinganta Prakaranam, and I don't think you have studied it, but I'm just going to give just two simple examples. I'll not go through the entire Prakriya, but we'll basically, learn only the relevant portion. So in order to understand the application of Punah Prasanga Vijnanat Siddham, we are going to take this Yaja Dhatu, which is a Dhatu in the Bhadi Gana, and we are going to look at the forms of the lit lakara, Iyaja, Ijatuhu, Ijuhu. In this particular Iyaja, Ijatuhu, Ijuhu, let's focus on this particular Ijatuhu form. So in lit lakara, there are two primary things that usually happen. First is the Adesha of the Pratyaya. The pratyayas of the lit lakar, tip, tas, ji, they get converted to nal, atus, us, and then a bunch of other pratyayas. So tip becomes nal, tas becomes atus, and ji becomes us. So there is a sutra that converts the parasmai pada forms of the lit lakara to nal, atus, us. So in case of this ijatuhu, that lit lakarasya tas pratyaya is getting converted to atus. So we have the configuration of Yaja plus Atus. Now in the configuration of Yaja plus Atus, there are two possibilities that can go up. First is that because it is a lit lakara, a typical task that happens in lit lakara is dvitvam. Liti dhator nabhyasasya iti dvitvam bhavati. Most of the lit lakara forms that you see, chakara, papatha, and so on, there will be a dvitvam. So then at this stage, when you have yaja plus atus, you are required to do a dvitvam, and then the dvitvam will give you yaja plus atus. So that would be the configuration. However, there is another sutra that's going to conflict that particular yaja plus atus. Atus is considered a kit pratyaya. Kit, a pratyaya which has a kakara itsamnyaka in it. The pratyaya atus is considered a kit pratyaya. It does not have a kakara itsamnyaka in it, but there is a sutra in the sutra patha which says asanyogat litkita. It says sanyoga bhinna varnat parasya lit lakarasya apit pratyayah kidvad bhavati. Now, if you take this configuration yaja plus atus, in the configuration of yaja plus atus, there are two possibilities. One is the dvitvam giving yaja plus atus. Yaja is basically going to get duplicated. So that's one choice. Second choice, in order to understand what that second choice is, we need to understand that this particular atus pratyaya, it does not have an itsamnyaka kakara in it, but we still call it as a kita pratyaya. Why do we call it as a kita pratyaya? Because there is an atidesha sutram that forces a kidvad bhava on atus. What atidesha sutra? Asanyogat lit kita. Let's break this sutram down. Asanyogad means sanyoga bhinna varnat. Now, in the current configuration, there is no sanyoga anywhere. Ya, ja, tu, sa. You don't have a sanyoga. Sanyoga is halonantara sanyoga, like dra and so on. So there is no sanyoga. So that condition is satisfied. Lit lakara. This condition is also satisfied. Apit pratyaya. There is no itsamnyaka pakara in the pratyaya. Out of the 18 pratyayas, only 3 pratyayas are pitta pratyayas. Tip, sip, mip. Rest all 15 are apit. Tip, tas, ji, sip, thasta. You don't find a pa anywhere. Only tip, sip, mip. These are pit. Rest all 15, including all atmanepada also. So rest all 15 are apit. So in this particular configuration, yaja plus atus, you have a sanyoga bhinna varna, or everything is sanyoga bhinna. You have lit lakar and you have apit pratyaya. Their pratyaya becomes kita pratyaya, and therefore this atus is a kita pratyaya. Why are we forcing the kitva, or why are we interested in the kitva of this pratyaya? Because as soon as atus becomes a kitta pratyaya, there is a sutram called vachiswapi yajadinam kiti, which gives a samprasarana. The sutra says vachi means the vacha dhatu, swapi means the swapa dhatu, and yajadis, the dhatus that begin with yaja and the corresponding set of dhatus. The list is there in Kashika. So for all those dhatus, if there is a kita pratyaya in front, samprasaranam happens. Samprasaranam is the conversion of yana letter to a corresponding ik letter. Igyana samprasaranam. So vacha plus kta pratyaya becomes ukta. Va gets converted to u by samprasaranam. Kta is a kit pratyaya. Swapa plus kta becomes a supta. Va gets converted to u. Again samprasaranam. Yaja plus kta becomes ishta. Ya becomes E, that is also samprasaranam. So when the verbs such as vacha, swapa and the verbs of the yajadigana are followed by a kitta pratyaya, samprasarana happens on the corresponding yana letter which is present in the dhatu. Now what is happening over here? You have yaja plus atus. Atus pratyaya is a kit pratyaya by a sanyogad lit kita. Therefore, it is going to force a samprasaranam on yaja. If it forces a samprasaranam on yaja, it will be ija. So what are the two conflicting karyas? First conflicting karya is dvitva, which causes yaja plus yaja. Second conflicting karya is samprasaranam, which causes ija plus atus. So first is yaja plus atus and ija plus atus. Both of them apply at the same time, and therefore we have to choose the correct one using the purva parabhava. So then we choose the samprasaranam. Why? Because samprasaranam is 6115, which is swapiyajadi nam kiti, and liti dhatoranabhyasasya is 618. So the sutra that gives dvitvam is 618. The sutra that gives samprasaranam is 6115. So we are forced to do the samprasaranam first. We do the samprasaranam ija plus atus. But even after doing samprasaranam, you can still do dvitva. Technically, you can do dvitva because ija dhatu is by sthanivat bhava yaja dhatu. The point is we want a dvitva in the current case. Why? Because after doing the samprasaranam, forget about what is written in this prakriya. This is program generated. There might be mistakes over here. Listen to what I am saying. So after you do the ija first, so in the configuration of ija plus atus, the final form that you require is ijatuhu. That dirgha ikara is created when ija gets duplicated and ja gets removed. So when ija gets duplicated and ja gets removed, it will be e plus ija. By savarna dirgha, it will be ija that will give you the correct form. If you just do the samprasaranam and keep ija plus atus, you are not going to get the dirgha form ijatuhu. If you do the dvitvam first, yaja atus, and then try to do the samprasaranam, then only the second yaja can become ija because only that is followed by kit pratyaya. The first yaja is not followed by kit pratyaya. So then it will be yaja plus ija plus atus and completely different forms will create. Therefore, in order to get the correct form, first is we choose the correct sutram which is samprasaranam by paratva. So we say yaja plus atus iti sthite. Option number 1, dvitvam yaja plus atus. Option 2, vachiswapi yajadinam kiti iti samprasaranam ija plus atus. एतयोः मध्ये विप्रतिषेधेन ija plus atus iti प्राप्यते. So ija plus atus, that will be winning, that will be executed. After ija plus atus is done, the purva sutra will come in the place. You might be able to block it by sakrutgato vipratishethe yad badhitam tad badhitam eva, but it is a wrong tool to use because if you use that tool, you will not get the ijatuhu form. So in order to get the ijatuhu form, you must then apply the dvitva again, and you have Punav Prasanga Vijnanat Siddham. There's a paribhasha to do that. So Punav Prasanga Vijnanat Siddham will allow you the duplication of ija, giving ija atus. Haladi Sheshaha will get rid of that jakara, leaving e plus ija plus atus. E plus e savarna dirgha will be ijatus. Visarga nirmanam will give ijatu. Same is applicable everywhere you have a dirgha ikara. So in all those remaining 15 cases, it is all asanyoga lita kita. So there is a kidvat bhava. And obviously, therefore, there is a samprasaranam. The dvitva is anyway going to happen. So this conflict between dvitva and samprasaranam happens in all the remaining 15 cases. That is the reason why everywhere you see dirgha ikara, this dirgha ikara has to be obtained by doing the dvitva on ija. The way to do the dvitvam on ija is first to get ija. Take time to digest and understand this. That's what I said. This is the reason why I'm giving only one or two prakriyas. Extremely complex at the level that you have studied, right?
इज इति सम्प्रसारणं कृत्वा इज इति रूपं निष्पद्यते, अनन्तरं द्वित्वं क्रियते खलु, तत्र
Correct. So,
द्वित्वम् इज इत्यस्य एव भवति वा?
because ija is a dhatu, right? See, it doesn't say yaja dhatoh dvitvam bhavati. It says dhatoh dvitvam bhavati. Liti dhator anabhyasasya says dhatoh dvitvam bhavati. Now, yaja and ija, their dhatu samnya is not going anywhere. Samprasarana does not remove the dhatu samnya. So, whatever part of the or structure of the dhatu that you see over there, that undergoes a duplication. Anybody wants to repeat what I said just to, ensure that you have understood what I said correctly?
अकित् इति अधिदिश्यते, अतः यकारस्य सम्प्रसारणं भवति, यकारस्य सम्प्रसारणम् इ इति, अतः यज् इति इज् भवति। पुनः व्हाट वाज दैट?
पुनः प्रसंगविज्ञानात्
पुनः प्रसंगविज्ञानात् द्वारं तु उद्घाटितमेव अस्ति, अतः there is nothing preventing the dvitvam from happening, and especially because we require dirgha ikaraha for the correct rupam. अतः द्वित्वम् अनन्तरम् आफ्टर डूइंग सम्प्रसारणं द्वित्वं भवति, द्वित्वं कृत्वा द सेकेंड द फर्स्ट द्वित्वस्य जकारः अन्तिम लेटर गेट्स लोपसंज्ञा,
जकारस्य लोपः ई सवर्ण दीर्घे दीर्घ इकारः सिद्ध्यति.
So E and E join and give you savarna dirgha.
Okay, savarna dirghe dirgha ikara siddhyati. Okay, so you also need to do the practice in speaking this in Sanskritam. I usually explain in English because it is very easy to understand, but let's spend some time in doing the same prakriya in Sanskrit. At least I'll just give you one example. So what do we say? Dhatoho lit lakarasya prathama purusha dvivachanasya ijatuhu iti rupasya siddhau ija dhana atus iti sthite लिटि धातोरनभ्यासस्य इति द्वित्वं तथा च वचिस्वपि यजादीनां किति इति कित् प्रत्यये परे संप्रसारणम् इति उभयोः और इति युगपत् प्राप्तिः। अतुस् प्रत्ययः कित् कित् कथम् इति चेत् असंयोगाद् लिट् कित् इति सूत्रेण तत्र किद्वद्भावः इज धन अतुस् इत्यत्र संयोग भिन्नात् विहितः अपित् लिट् प्रत्ययः किद्वद् भवति। अतः अनेन सूत्रेण किद्वदतिदेशः किद्वद्भावे कृते वचिस्वपि यजादीनां किति इति संप्रसारणेन इज इत्यस्य प्राप्तिः। एतादृशं वचिस्वपि यजादीनां किति तथा च लिटि धातोरनभ्यासस्य इत्येतयोः युगपत् प्राप्तिः। लिटि धातोरनभ्यासस्य इति लिट् लकारस्य द्वित्वविशिष्टं सूत्रम्। अन्येषु बहुषु स्थलेषु तस्य प्रसक्तिः अस्ति, चकार पपाठ जगाम इत्यादिषु। वचिस्वपि यजादीनां किति इति संप्रसारण विशिष्टं सूत्रम्। तस्य प्रसक्तिः कित् प्रत्ययन विषयेषु अस्ति, क्त क्तवतु क्त्वाक् तिन् इत्यादिषु। अतः उभयोः अन्यत्र अवकाशः। अत्र युगपत् प्राप्तिः एकत्र प्रसंगः उभय प्रसंगः कुत्र यज धातोः प्रथम पुरुषस्य द्विवचनस्य अतुस् प्रत्यये परे। अस्यां स्थितौ विप्रतिषेधे परं कार्यम् इत्यनेन संप्रसारणं प्रथमं क्रियते। संप्रसारणे कृते इज प्लस अतुस् इति जायते। अस्यां स्थितौ वस्तुतः लिटि धातोरनभ्यासस्य इत्यनेन प्राप्तस्य द्वित्वस्य बाधः कृतः अस्ति, परन्तु तादृशः एव बाधः क्रियते चेत् इष्टरूपं न सिद्ध्यति। इष्टरूपसिद्ध्यर्थं पुनः प्रसंगविज्ञानात् सिद्धम् इति परिभाषा आश्रयणीया। अस्याः परिभाषायाः किं मानम् इति चेत् विप्रतिषेधे परं कार्यम् इत्यत्र द्वार अस्मिन् पक्षे विप्रतिषेधे परम् अवश्यं क्रियते इति विधिसूत्ररूपेण अस्य विधानं कृत्वा एकवारं परं कृत्वा तदनन्तरम् इष्टं चेत् पूर्वसूत्रमपि तत्र प्रयोक्तव्यम् इति न्यायेन पुनः प्रसंगविज्ञानात् सिद्धम् इति परिभाषा सिद्धा। अस्याः परिभाषायाः आधारेण आदौ संप्रसारणे कृते तदनन्तरं लिटि धातोरनभ्यासस्य इति द्वित्वे कृते इज इज अतुस् इति स्थिते हलादिशेषः इति जकारलोपे सवर्णदीर्घे कृत्वविसर्गे ईजतुः इति रूपसिद्धिः। क्लियर? Okay, this is how you should be creating all your answers, okay, without a single and without any kind of thinking here and there. And this only happens when the entire prakriya runs in front of your eyes. If you are stuck at one place when talking that place, you won't be able to go to the next place. Okay, this is how a vakyartha has to be done. But in order to understand, it's okay to explain these concepts and complex concepts in a language that you want to understand or you are better in understanding. I'll give you another example. Again, examples are going to be complex because you have not come across these examples, but I'll just give you one example and then we will move on. The example that I want to give is this adhyeta. I'll walk you through this particular example. ईङ् अध्ययने इति अदादिगणस्य धातुः अस्ति. अयं धातुः सामान्यरूपेण अधि उपसर्गेण सह एव प्रयुक्तः दृश्यते. So you typically do not see the independent use of the ing dhatu. It's always seen used with adhi. So all the forms are also with the adhi. In this particular dhatu, it is atmanepadi dhatu. In this particular dhatu, we are interested in the lut lakara form. Lut lakara is bhavishyat kala. लुट् लकारे तत्र प्रथमपुरुष एकवचनस्य अध्येता इति रूपं कथं सिद्ध्यति तत् पश्यामः. So in general, the lut lakara forms have the pratyayas ta, taro, taraha, tasi, tastha, tastha, tasmi, tasva, tasmaha. Okay, so ta, taro, taraha. The sutra is simple, lut of prathamasya darau rasaha. So the sutra that gives this ta, taro, taraha is lut of prathamasya darau rasaha. Very simple sutram. It says, in case of lut lakara, the pratyayas of the prathama purusha, tip, tas, jhi, these are the three pratyayas of parasmai pada, and ta, atam, jha. These are the pratyayas of the atmani pada. So he says prathama purusha. So both the padas have to be taken. They are converted into da, rau, and ras. So lut lakarasya prathama purushasya pratyayanam da, rau, and ras iti trayah adeshaha bhavanti. So then you have to map. Tip, tas, ji correspondingly get converted to da, rau, ras. Again, ta, atam, jha correspondingly get converted to da, rau, ras. And in the da, that da is its samyaka by chutu. So only a remains. And then ta comes up and then you say ta. So ganta, patita, hasita, and so on. All these forms because of this lut of prathamasya dara urasaha. So this tas comes as the vikarana pratyaya because of setasil rulutoho. In one type of bhavishyat kal, sya comes as a vikarana pratyaya. In second type of bhavishyat kal, tas comes as a vikarana pratyaya. So eventually you get patita, hasita, ganta, karta, and so on. These forms are very similar to truch. So truch forms are also patita, ganta, and so on. Karta, and so on. These forms are very similar to those particular forms. So अत्र अध्येता इत्यस्य प्रक्रियायां किं भवति पश्यामः. Now typically when it comes to atmanepada, this dhatu is atmanepadi. So we only focus on atmanepada. Now typically in the atmanepada, the pratyaya of atmanepada is ta. See, tip, tas, ji, sip, thas, tha, mip, was, mas, ta, atam, jha. So the pratyaya in the atmanepada is ta. However, there is a sutram, ita atmane padanam tere. I don't know how many of you have studied this. This is all new. That's why I'm a little hesitant in teaching all this. Tita atmane padanam tere. This sutra says, if there is a tit lakara, what are tit lakaras? Lata, lita, lutta, lrta, lota. These are all tit lakaras. Late is excluded because it is a Vaidika lakara. It is still a tit lakara, but we don't need to talk about it. So these are tit lakaras. The lakaras are classified into two groups. You have tit lakaras and you have nit lakaras. Lang, ling, lung, rung are nit lakaras. Rest 6 are tit lakaras. In case of tit lakaras, the atmanepada pratyayas, the T samyaka of that, T samya is the last swara followed by everything else. So the T samya of an atmanepada pratyaya is converted to A. Therefore, in the prathama purusha ekvachan, you see forms like vandate. The pratyaya is actually ta. Tiptas ji, sipthas tha, mipvasmas, ta atam ja. So the pratyaya is ta. But the T samyaka of this ta, which is a at the end, it gets converted to a. Tita atmane padanam tere. So this a gets converted to a and you get the form vandate. In the same way, atma all others. So uttama purusha ekvachan also, the pratyaya is e, it gets converted to a and therefore you get labhe. In all the tit lakaras, all the atmanepada pratyayas, the T samyaka gets converted to A. This is one sutram that is going to apply in the current case, because you are talking about the lut lakara of ing dhatu in the atmane pada. It is a titta lakara, therefore you will have to at least think about tita atmane padanam tere. That is one sutra that comes over here. The second sutra which I mentioned is Syatasi Lulrutoho. This sutram says, in case of Lut Lakara, the dhatu gets the Tas Vikarana Pratyaya. Tas comes as a Vikarana Pratyaya and sits in between. So you have, say, Patha, and you have any Pratyaya. Now here there need not be Atmane Pada. This can be Parasmai Pada also. Patha is a Parasmai Padi dhatu. You get the tip pratyaya in front, and in between you get a tas as the vikarana pratyaya. So patha plus tas plus tipa. Okay, so tas comes as a vikarana pratyaya. Both of these can happen at the same time. Now out of this tas vikarana pratyaya, it is a lakara vikarana pratyaya. Therefore, it always comes before anything happens to the pratyaya. This is a siddhanta that you will learn probably when you learn Tinganta Prakaram, that a fundamental difference between a Gana Vikarana Pratyayas like Shapa, Shyana and so on, and the Lakara Vikarana Pratyayas is that the Lakara Vikarana Pratyaya comes first and then the Pratyaya Karya happens. Therefore, in the configuration of E plus T, before converting T to Te, the Tas Vikarana Pratyaya comes and you say E plus Tas plus T. You had E plus T. T is the Atmane Pada Pratyaya. Atmane Pada Prathama Purusha Ekvachan Pratyaya. You have E plus T. Adhiv is there. I'm just ignoring that. E plus T. In the configuration of E plus T, technically Tita Atmane Padanam Tere will convert E to A. But even before that, the Vikarana Pratyaya comes. The Lakara Vikarana Pratyayas are considered Antarangas. Syadayah Antarangaha Shannadayah Bahirangaha is the statement in the Bhashya. Now I don't know where it is written. अथवा अंतरंगाः स्यादयः सार्वधातुके शन्नादयः. So he says syadis are antarangas. Antaranga means you now understand that it should be done first, because after utsarga apavada antaranga bahiranga comes. So syadi is an example of antaranga. So you first do the antaranga karya. So now you have e plus ta. Tas is ta, you can ignore so for now. E plus ta plus ta. So far so good. Now there is a conflict. What kind of conflict? Tita atmane padanam tere converts ta to te. Etva bhavati. And lutaf prathamasya daraurasaha converts the pratyaya to da. So ta pratyaya, there are two sutras acting on the ta pratyaya. There is tita atmane padanam tere causing ekara desha. There is lutaf prathamasya daraurasaha causing da or a adesha.
Mahoday, the pratyaya here is the vikarana or the just a lut pratyaya.
Lakara pratyaya, right? Ta is
Lakara
lakara
pratyaya.
pratyaya.
It
So
is
E
Vikarana
plus T.
Pratyaya.
This is Atmane Pad. This is clear. Atmane Pada Prathama Purusha Ekavachana. In this particular configuration, I have to add a Vikarana Pratyaya. Laka. Oh, that's what you got confused. Vikarana Pratyayas are of two types. There is something called Gana Vikarana Pratyaya and there is something called Lakara Vikarana Pratyaya. Have you not heard of these two types? Okay, so Lakar.
Shap and all Gana Vikarana pratyaya, right?
Gana Vikarna Pratyaya are the ones that are specific to Gana. So Bhadi Gana has a different Pratyaya, Adadi Gana, not Adadi, Divadi Gana has a different Pratyaya, fifth Gana, seventh Gana, ninth Gana, all have different Pratyayas. Those are Gana Vikarna Pratyayas. Lakara Vikarna Pratyayas are the Pratyayas that are specific to Lakara. So you take any Bhavishyat Kala form, Dasyati, Pathishyati, Hasishyati, Gamishyati, there will be Sya. It doesn't depend on whether the dhatu is in 8th gana, karishyati, 9th gana, jnasyati, apsyati, dasyati. Gana dhatu is that sphere comes. such a vikarana pratyaya is called lakara vikarana pratyaya. So you have two types of vikarana pratyayas. Gana vikarana pratyayas are specific to dhatus and ganas. Lakara vikarana pratyayas have nothing to do with dhatus, they have only to do with lakara. Now both the pratyayas never come. So then the 10 lakaras are divided into two groups. For some types of lakaras, the gana vikarana pratyaya comes. For other types of lakaras, the lakara vikarana pratyaya comes. Okay, so the lut belongs to the other type of lakaras where the lakara vikarana pratyaya comes. Therefore, here in case of e plus the, you have a lakara vikarana pratyaya coming because lut is in the lakara vikarana pratyaya group. It will not get a gana vikarana. So e plus ta plus the. The fundamental difference between these two, the lakara vikarana pratyaya and the gana vikarana pratyaya, is that the gana vikarana pratyaya happens after the pratyaya get converted to adeshas, whatever lakara desha happens. Whereas in case of lakara vikarana pratyaya, they are antaranga, which means even before the lut or lut gets converted to to. So even when it is lut, even in that case you get a lakara vikarana pratyaya. So lakara vikarana pratyayas is usually the first step in the prakriya. The lut lakara is not even converted to tiptas g and so on. So first we will get the lakara vikarana pratyaya e plus ta plus luta, and then you will have e plus ta plus ta. This is by tiptas g. After that you have two choices. You have tit atmane padanam tere causing ekaradesha. Let me write it down. Tit atmane padanam tere causing ekaradesha. Why? Because is this a tit lakara? Yes. Is there an atmane pada? Yes. And therefore ta gets converted to te. This is one choice. Okay, and second choice is lutaf prathamasya darau rasaha, where ta gets converted to a. Technically it is da, but da is it samyaka, so you say a. Now what are the numbers? Tita atmane padanam tere is 3479. Lutaf prathamasya darau rasaha is 2485. The question that you are asked is there a vipratishedha? So tita atmane padanam tere anyatra prapti asti va? Asti. Labhate,
Asti.
vandate, and so on. So there are examples. Labhate, vandate, and so on. Pachate. Tatra titatmani badanam tere iti bhavati. Lutaf prathamasya anyatra prasaktihi asti va? Asti.
Lutlakare.
लुट् लकारे परस्मै पदे यत्र आत्मने पदानां टेरे इति सूत्रं न प्रवर्तते. पठिता, गन्ता, कर्ता, हसिता. In all these cases, you still get the prasakti of lut of prathamasya darau rasaha. At that point in time, tita atmane padanam cannot conflict because there is no atmane pada. We are talking about parasmai pada. Lut of prathamasya is common for the three forms of parasmai pada and three forms of atmane pada. Whereas the tita atmane padanam is only for atmane pada. Therefore, lut of prathamasya has a scope in the parasmai pada. So there is a conflict. In case of conflict, vipratishedhe param karyam will force us to do tita atmane padanam tere. If you do tita atmane padanam tere, the form that you e plus ta plus te. However, what you want is e plus ta plus a. So the correct form is adhi plus e, so that becomes a later on, plus ta plus a. How do you bring it back? By punaf prasanga vijnanat siddham. So you do a wrong operation first because you are forced to do the wrong operation by vipratishedhe param karyam, and Vartikakara actually proposes a correct operation over here. Very beautiful discussion in Lutaf Prathamasya Darau Rasaha Bhashya. See this. Titam te vidhe luto darau rasaha purva vipratishidham. You understand the conflict. What is happening? You want ta to a. By vipratishedhe param karyam, you are forced to do ta to te. So Vartikakara proposes a Vartika and he says, when there is a conflict between Tita Atmane Padanam Tere and Lut of Prathamasya Darau Rasaha, choose Lut of Prathamasya Darau Rasaha because that is the correct thing that to do in case of adhi plus e plus ta, the next conversion should not be ta to te, but it should be ta to a. This adhi plus a plus ta plus a should give you the correct form, and therefore Vartikakara proposes titam tere, titatmadevanam tere. So tere is the word he uses. Titam tere vidhe lutaha daraurasaha purva vipratishiddham, which allows us to choose the purva sutra over the parasutra. And does Bhashyakara accept this? Bhashyakara says there is no need to accept this. It's okay if you do ta to te. You can still use the punaf prasanga vijnana paribhasha. Etve krute punaf prasanga vijnana daraur saha bhavishyanti. So he banks on the existing punaf prasanga vijnana and gets rid of one purva vipratishedha vartika. So I purposely gave you two different examples. The example of Ijatuhu was the case where both the karyas were useful. You do one and then you do another. I now gave you a second example where there is a wrong karya and a right karya, and the wrong karya gets done first because of Vipratishedhe Param Karyam. Thankfully, the right karya overwrites the karya because of Punah Prasanga Vijnana Siddha. Is everybody with me so far, or is it a loaded class today? Actually, a lot of new prakriyas. So
second sutra does not work at all, is it? Tita Atmane
which sutra?
Padanam Tere does not work at all.
It works. That's the beauty. Tita Atmane Padanam Tere will work. So you will get adhi plus e plus ta plus te, and then you will get adhi plus e plus ta plus a by Punah Prasanga Vijnana Siddham.
So both the
gets converted to a.
different order.
Order means first you have to convert ta to te because it is a para sutra. You are forced to do that. You have to follow the rules. You're forced to do that. Okay. Thankfully, that's not a bad thing because it anyway gets overwritten by Lutaf Prathamasya Daraurasaha. And Lutaf Prathamasya does not talk about ta or te. It says Lut Lakarasya Prathama Purusha Pratyaha Daraurasaha. So te becomes da. Okay.
But here, why can't we take that something called Pradipadoktatvam? Atra lut is sakshat uktam asti, whereas tit is common for all the tit pratyaya. So lut is more specific, so why can't we take it as appropriate sutram?
Lutaf Prathamasya Daraurasaha says Lut Lakarasya Prathama Purushasya Pratyaha. Lutaha Prathamasya. So what are the Prathama Purushas of the Lut Lakar? Lut is not Prathama Purusha. Lutaha Prathamasya. So Prathama Purushasya Pratyayar Tiptasjhi or Ta Atamjha. Right?
But
It's not saying conversion of Lut.
why people, I mean, Panini, somewhere he says like, Punah Prasanga can be done, and somewhere Purva Vipratisheda.
Panini does not say any of that. This is the commentators that say.
I mean, commentary, whatever. Like here, Purva Vipratisheda can also be taken, right?
If Purva Vipratishedha is taken, you don't need Punah Prasanga. Correct?
Correct.
If Purva Vipratishedha is taken, you can just say Purva Vipratishedhena Titatmane Padanam Tere Ityase Badham Krutva Lutaf Prathamase Ittenena Akaradesha. Or you can stick with Vipratishedhe Param Karyam and do the Punah Prasanga Vijnana Siddham. Okay? Now, Punah Prasanga Vijnana Siddham is a case that is used in elsewhere many places. Obviously, you can say Purva Vipratishedha is also used at some other places. But because Punah Prasanga Vijnana Siddham is accepted as a paribhasha, Bhashyakara opinionates or opines that he wants to go with that. Even if you choose Purva Vipratishedha in this case, it's not exactly. Nothing wrong in it. Yes, nothing wrong in it. It is not necessary. So he doesn't say it is wrong. He says anavashyakam asti. He says etve krute punah prasanga vijnanat avashyam daraurasaha bhavitum arahanti. So then you don't need to talk about Purva Vipratishedha. If you do Purva Vipratishedha, you are actually contradicting Vipratishedhe Param Karyam. Whereas if you do Punah Prasanga Vijnana Siddham, you are using Vipratishedhe Param Karyam and building on the top of it. So he prefers building on Panini's sutras rather than outrightly rejecting or contradicting Panini's sutras. Okay, this is again a choice. Even if you do Vipratishedha in this case, no harm is going to happen, no problem is going to get created. So we saw two different examples, as I mentioned. In one case, both the sutras are required. In the second case, a wrong sutra gets invoked first, and then that gets corrected by overwriting it with the right sutram. And it is possible to use Purva Vipratishedha in this case to avoid all this circus. So that brings us to this next concept, which is written in the Bhashya, the concept of Purva Vipratishedha. Let's talk about that now. So in the Bhashya, he says all these things about Punav Prasanga Vijnana Siddham and Sakrudgato Vipratishide Yad Baditam Tad Baditam Eva and so on. And after doing discussion on these paribhashas, he proposes the concept of Purva Vipratishedha. He says, let's propose a paribhasha called Vipratishedhe Param Angadhikare Purvam. He says, in case of Angadhikara, you will need to do the Purva Vipratishedha as against Para Vipratishedha. What is Purva Vipratishedha? Vipratishedha happens. Tulya Balatva happens. There is Ubhaya Praptihi, but you choose or you end up in choosing the Purva Sutra over the Para Sutra. Right? In general, you will choose the Parasutra, but in typical cases, you will end up in choosing the Purva Sutra. Vartikakara proposes over here that I have observed that in Angadhikara, in many places, you are forced to do the Purva Vipratisheda. Obviously, that's not true because we have seen the example of Vrukshebhya. That's an Angadhikara Karya and you still are doing the Parasutra. But he says, in general, I have observed that for a large number of cases, you end up in choosing the Purva Sutra, Vipratishedhe Purvam Karyam. So he says, let's do the Paribhasha, Vipratishedhe Param Angadhikare Purvam. So Vipratishedhe Param Ityuktva Angadhikare Purvam iti Vaktavyam. And then he says, why do you want to do this? Kim Krutam Bhavati? Why do you want to make such a Paribhasha? He says, if you make such a Paribhasha, you don't need to enumerate all Purva Vipratishedhas one by one. And then I think you have studied these Purva Vipratishedhas in your course. Guna Vruddhi Autva Trujvad Bhavebhyo Num Vipratishidham and Numachir Trujvad Bhavebhyo Nut Vipratishidham. So there are two very common, there are around 10 Vipratishedhas or 12 Vipratishedhas in the entire Bhashya. Will not go in those. But these two particular Vipratishedhas, Guna Vruddhi Autva Trujvad Bhavebhyo Num Purva Vipratishidham and Numachir Trujvad Bhavebhyo Nut Purva Vipratishidham. Have you studied these two Purva Vipratishedhas in your course? Have you studied all of them? Like how does guna work? How does vriddhi work? How does autva work? How does trujvad bhava work? As against the num. Similarly, how does
Yes.
num work, achir work, and trujvad bhava work is nut.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we don't need to go into individual examples. You already know all those things. So these are the two Purva Vipratishedhas that he proposes, and therefore let's make a general statement: Vipratishedhe Paramangadhikare Purvam, and then obviously Bhashyakara shorts it down. Bhashyakara says obviously there are going to be other cases where in Angadhikara also there Para Vipratishedha is possible, and then he gives a very interesting statement. He says Para does not necessarily mean later. Para means the one that is acceptable or one that is great or the one that is appropriate and so on. So he says asti parashabda bahuvarte vartate. Sorry, go ahead, go ahead.
Nothing, Ishtam.
Ishtam, exactly. So ishtam. So he says, let's use the para word to mean ishtam. And then he says, katham parashabdaha ayam bahuvarthaha. There are four different meanings of para word that he gives over here. First of all, asti eva vyavasthayam vartate. Vyavastha, direction. So purva disha, para disha. Asti anyarthe vartate. Para can also mean anya. Paraputraha means parasya putraha. Parasya bharya means anyasya bharya. So that's anya. Pradhanya, primary, is the third meaning of the para word. So param iyam brahmana kulam. So this brahmana kula is sreshtha. Param brahma, the brahma is sarva sreshtha. So pradhana or sreshtha ityasmin arthe parashabdaha vidyate. Asti ishtavachi parashabdaha. Param dhama, even param brahma can be classified over here. Something that is desired, something that is ishta can be also referenced by para. So para has multiple meanings. Panini never specifies a meaning, so you can actually choose a meaning of ishta. Vipratishedhe ishtam karyam. When there is a vipratishedha, whichever sutra you think will give the correct form, use that vipratishedhe ishtam karyam. So this has to be taken with a pinch of salt. Ishtam karyam does not necessarily mean that you need to know all the prakriyas in advance and just write it like a computer. That's not what we are saying. We are saying that in most of the cases, para will resolve to the next sutra, the second upcoming sutra. But if it doesn't resolve, you can reinterpret the sutra by saying ishta, and then you can choose the purva sutra. Is what he says over here. So तद्यदा इष्टवाची परशब्दः तस्य इदं ग्रहणं विप्रतिषेधे परम इत्युक्ते विप्रतिषेधे यदिष्टं तद्भवति. In most of the cases, ishta is the same as para in the dishavachi sense, later occurring para. That's the vyavastha. So asti eva vyavasthayam vartate. Purva is previous, para is later. That is the meaning that we typically take. Vipratishethe param karyam means anantaram vidyamanam karyam karaniyam. But he says there is also another meaning called ishtavachi parashabdaha. You can use this particular meaning if the other meanings don't make sense in a particular case. If you just use ishtavachi parashabda everywhere, then there is no need of Vyakarana Shastra at all. In every step you do ishtavachi karya. Then no other sutras are required, because every time something ishta you know, you do that, and that will solve the problem. That's not how this has to be interpreted.
In the case of that Numachira, Trijvat Bhava and all that, none of those two paribhashas don't work, and they have to have a Vartikam to kind of say Purva Vipratisheda, is it?
Correct. Why? Because in case of Gunavriddhi Outpatrujat Bhavebhyo Num Purva Vipratishedham, you want to only do Num, and Num comes earlier. So even by doing Vipratishedha, if you do the second one first, then whether you do the first one or not, you will not get the right form. If you have not studied those, I will spend some time today or next class to go over each of the corresponding cases, like how Guna compares with Num, Vriddhi compares with Num, Autva compares with Num, and Trijvat Bhava compares with Num. I think you have studied it, but go back, refer to your notes. If you have not studied it, it is important that you study each of these mutual combinations.
Mahodaya, let's revise again.
Okay, we'll revise it in the next class. If you, I want you to try these out. I mean, I can do it right away. That's not an issue. But let's try it out, and then we will. I don't know how many of you have done the Vari homework, but if you have not yet done, please complete the Vari homework, because I want to go over each prakriya one by one in the Vari homework, and then at that point in time we will talk about these two Vartikas. So these Vartikas, as you already know, are used in the Vari prakriya. So we will study these Vartikas, and then we will go over the Vari homework. There are some other interesting concepts in the topic of Vari. That's why I've given that homework. Anyway, so now we can either stop, or I can spend like 10 minutes in explaining the remaining part, the Nitya versus Anitya and Antaranga versus Bahiranga. So let's see, I have actually taught this in the Krudanta course. I have that PPT present over here. I'll just show this PPT and discuss the relevant aspects of this PPT. So here in that PPT, I taught that you have Antaranga Apavadaha Baliyan. So the first is Apavada, then you have Bahiranga versus Antaranga. So Antaranga wins over Bahiranga, then Nitya Anitya, and finally Vipratishethe Param Karyam. So Purva Paranitya, that reverse cycle has to be done. Then I discussed the first topic of Apavada. Apavada, remember that first sutra must be completely inside the second sutra. So we say yena na prapte yo vidhir arabhyate satasya badhako bhavati. If you want to learn this, I'll walk through these things in the next class in details. But in general, Apavada is usually the first sutra is inside the second sutra. That is what we call as Apavada. We have talked a lot about Apavada, and I think most of you already know about Apavada. Antaranga Bahiranga is more interesting. Antaranga Bahiranga talks about the positioning of the nimitta with respect to sthani. So you have the sthani. There is one nimitta that does some change on the sthani, and there is other nimitta that does a different change on the sthani. But the other nimitta is outside the first nimitta in the sequential order. So when you start walking out from the sthani, you see the first nimitta first and then the second nimitta. In such a case, it is the karya done by the first nimitta that takes precedence, because it is internal, it is closer to the sthani as compared to the second one. The Vyakhya of Antaranga and Bahiranga given by Navya Nyaya are extremely convoluted. Look at the thing what he says or what they say. Bahiranga Shastra Sambandhi Nimitta Samudhaya Antarbhuta Nimittakatvam Antarangatvam Antaranga Shastra Sambandhi Nimitta Samudhaya Bahirabhuta Nimittakatvam Bahirangatvam. He defines one in terms of other. He says, what is antarangatvam? What is internal? Internal is something which is inside the external. What is external? External is something which is outside the internal. That is exactly what he says. Bahiranga Shastra Sambandhi Nimitta. A nimitta which causes a bahiranga karya to happen, tasya antarabhuta nimittakatvam. Inside that will be the nimitta for antaranga karya. Are, but what is bahiranga? Well, antarangasya nimitta tasmad bahi vidyamanam bahiranga. So what is exterior? The one which is outside interior. What is interior? The one which is inside exterior. This is exactly how he defines in the Navyanyaya language. So technically, prathama sutrasya prayogartham avashyakani nimittani yadi dvitiya sutrasya prayogartham avashyakanam nimittanam apekshaya samipe santi sthaninaha, then it is antaranga karya. A stock example given is this lacha plus ranavula. Okay, what happens in lacha plus ranavula? There is a sutra called checha which causes tugagama. Gacha becomes gacha. You have studied probably these. Checha sutra, you might have or might not, I don't know. So checha causes tugagama. The tugagama is on the a. The a of the la undergoes a tuk agama. And the nimitta is cha. Cha is the nimitta. Whereas ata upadhayaha causes vruddhi adesha on the same a. So patha becomes pathaka, a becomes a, and the nimitta is ranavula. So it's the same a on which tugagama is happening because of cha, and vruddhi is happening because of ranavula. So now you observe, this a is the sthani, the prathama karyasya nimittam is cha, and the second dvitiya karyasya nimittam is ranavula. Ranavula is exterior, cha is interior. So by antarangatvam, this is antaranga, this is bahiranga, and therefore che chaiti tugagame krute lachaka iti siddhite. Once you do the tugagama, a is no more in the upadha, so ata upadhaya cannot act. Clear on antaranga bahiranga?
Here, even if the dwaram is open, the second sutra cannot work.
So in this particular case, there is no dwara open. Why? Because if you do the checha as a tugagama, checha has to be done first. You don't do purva paratva, you do antaranga bahirangatva. This is antaranga. So checha executes first. When checha executes, you get latsa cha. So a is no more in the upadha. The vruddhi adesha is only on the upadha akara. Now you don't have upadha, you have a before upadha. So now you cannot do vruddhi adesha. So there is no question of even the prapti of ata upadhayaha after checha is done.
But if it is there, then it can be done.
If it is there, then you have to choose between punah prasanga vijnana siddham and sakrudgato vipratishe so as to come to a correct form.
Okay, looking at the final form, you decide.
Okay.
But not in the antaranga bahiranga case, right, Mahoday? Even here, would you apply that logic?
So in case of this particular example, it is not possible. In case of many other antaranga bahiranga karyas, you actually end up in doing the antaranga karya first and then you end up in doing the bahiranga karya. So antaranga and bahiranga are usually executed in sequence, first antaranga and then bahiranga. I can talk a little more about it. So antaranga bahiranga is actually used in the vakya anvakhyana paksha. Did I teach the difference between pada anvakhyana paksha and vakya anvakhyana paksha or no? Probably not. In Vakyan Vakhyana Paksha, there is a real power of Antaranga Bahiranga scene. I can spend some time if people are interested in explaining more examples on Antaranga Bahiranga. This is just an introduction so that you can keep on thinking at the back of your mind.
Trestrayah and Trichatru Striyam Tisruchatasru, they are Antaranga and Bahiranga. One is based on, somewhere I read it as Artha Nimittakam. Ataha, when the Nimittam is Artha based, Striyam, Artha based, then it becomes Bahiranga. Whereas
the point is, Arthapeksham Bahirangatvam is a Siddhanta that is not accepted by Nagesha. So we are going in much complex waters, but in general, Arthapekshatvam Bahirangatvam is not a Siddhanta that is finally accepted in Paribhashindushe. So see, Adhikasti Arthapekshatvam Nimitta Bahirangaha. So he says, what is Kayyata's opinion? Kayyata's opinion is that you can do the Antaranga Bahiranga based on Arthapekshitva, Naisha Siddhanta Yukti. This is not the Siddhanta. So we'll not go in any further details, but Arthapekshitvam, Antarangatvam, Bahirangatvam is not considered a Siddhanta. Those who do not understand what the question was, ignore it, because anyway it is not considered a Siddhanta. Okay, I'll just introduce Nitya Anitya in 1 minute and we'll stop, and in next class, if you're interested, we will elaborate on more details on this. So Nitya Anitya says that when one karya can be done either before or after the other, then it is Nitya. So Kruta Kruta Prasangi Shastram Nityam. When you have two karyas, you might see that second karya can be done before the first karya or it can be done after the first karya. So whether you do first karya or not, it doesn't really matter. The second karya can still be done. In such a case, that second karya is considered nitya. So prathama karyad anantaram dvitiya karyam shakyam, parantu dvitiya karyad anantaram prathama karyam na shakyam. Then prathama karya is anitya. Anitya means if you change the order, it will not happen. Whereas dvitiya karya is nitya. It will always happen. Whether you choose the prathama karya or whether you choose the dvitiya karya will eventually happen. So then dvitiya karya is considered nitya, and given a choice between doing it right now or doing it later, you do it right now. Clear or not clear? Prathama sutrena nirdishtam karyam क्रियते उत न क्रियते चेदपि द्वितीय सूत्रेण निर्दिष्टं कार्यम अवश्यम भवितुम अर्हति. Bhavitum arhati means what? Again, coming to the same discussion, there, if you do the prathama karya first, there will be dwara created and then second can happen, right? Whereas if you do the second one, something will happen, nimitta or something will be get blocked for the prathama karya and prathama will not happen. Therefore, prathama sutrena nirdishtam karyam kriyate uta na kriyate chet api dvitiya sutrishtam karyam avashyam bhavitum arhati. But same cannot be talked for second. If second is done, the nimitta of the first might get destroyed and the first cannot happen again. In such a case, the second karya is called nitya, the first karya is called anitya, and the nitya wins over anitya. Stock example, if you want to have sixth gana dhatu tuda plus tipa, you can do puganta laghu padhasya cha, which is upadha guna. Remember, I told that gana vikarana comes later in the prakriya. So tuda plus tipa, lat lakara prathama purusha ekvachana, you get puganta laghu padhasya cha iti upadha gunaha is one karya. And tudadibhya sha is another karya. Now, if you do sha, you cannot do the guna because sha is nit pratyaya, nitvat pratyaya. So guna is blocked. But whether you do the guna or not in the initial case, to the becoming toda, you can still bring in sha. So sha is nitya, upadha guna is anitya, and therefore you always use the nitya sutra. Nitya versus anitya is the most common case in all the prakriyas. You can easily enumerate 100 examples just by thinking a little. So again, if people are interested, I'll spend more time on Antaranga Bahiranga and Nitya Anitya in some other class, maybe one of the next classes. But before that, in the next class, what we have to do is first we have to understand the examples of Purva Vipratisheda, work these out if you want, and we want to understand, go over the entire Prakriya of Vari and go over the Prakriya of each form step by step.
So why can't we apply this Nitya Anitya concept for this Tita Atmane Padanam Tere and Lutah Pratamasya Daru Rasaha?
Because each of them is blocking other, right? See, it's the same ta. Tita Atmane Padanam Tere converts it to te. Lutah Prathamase Daru Rasa converts it to a. And whether one happens, the other will automatically happen. So each of them is nitya with respect to another. If you do ta to te can still get converted to a. And if you do
Okay.
ta to a can get still converted to te. So either of them
Okay.
is nitya. Or either of them is anitya. I mean, there is a different definition of anitya. Shabdantarasya prapnun vidhira nityo bhavati. By that, each of them is anitya. So basically, each of them behaves in the same way, whether you treat it as nitya or anitya.
But anyway,
Any
we
more
want
questions?
A only, right? We don't want
We
they.
want a only. We want
There
a
is no
only. Correct.
point.
Correct. We want a only. So somehow we have to work out the prakriya so that you get a. Nitya Anitya is not helping you out. Both of them are Nitya or both of them are Anitya depending on what definition of Nitya and Anitya you take. So Vartikakara proposes Purva Vipratishedha, and Bhashyakara says you can do Vipratishedha followed by Punah Prasanga Vijnanacitta. So before we conclude Vipratishedhe Param Karyam discussion, things that I want to talk. One is Purva Vipratishedha followed by Vari word. And second is probably a little more elaborate discussion with a few more examples on Antaranga Bahiranga and Nitya Nitya and Utsargapavada. All three. I think these are the materials of one class each.
And also, like in the previous one where you mentioned that Utsarga Pavada, right? That fully contained is just one of the aspects, right?
Yes, I'll talk about that also. Non-fully contained is usually typically seen in Subanta Prakriya, and I will talk about all those examples of Subanta Prakriya in detail. The article that I've written, we'll go over the entire article in detail because probably it will take one more class, but it's worth going because you have studied the Subanta Prakriya in details.